You are very welcome to this video about trust in general, trust in the information that's coming your way and the analysis that's coming your way, trust that you can negotiate effectively the informational environment in your democracy. Most of you are watching this from Western democracies. And trust in trust that there is enough trust in your democracy for that democracy to endure in the short and medium term. That's a general conversation, and I want to say a couple of quick things in the waters of that general conversation first, and then move to two questions that came in from supporters of our conversation on YouTube on Patreon, which is this new way to support what we're doing. And they are excellent questions that really go to the core of what a lot of people are worried about. One's from Izzy and one's from Michael, and we're going to come to them. And they're specific questions about what sources to trust on Russia. So let's start with the general stuff. The crisis that we've got in the Western world today is a crisis of trust, whereby we're not just losing the capacity to share a mental world, we're losing the capacity to participate in the shared fact world. And that's a real problem. You can no longer get folks to agree that it rained yesterday, and sometimes you can't even get folks to agree that up is up and down is down. And that problem is getting worse and worse and worse with each year that passes in most Western democracies. And the place where it's perhaps at its worst now is the United States. And that's a problem because the United States and the way it handles the informational environment has repercussions for all Western countries. So this is a real problem. And the larger conversation it raises is about the connection that we can't explore now, but it's worth mentioning, between truth and democracy. To what extent can democracy exist at all without the value of truth in that democracy having a relatively healthy life, being alive enough? And by truth and truthfulness, we don't mean going around and getting everything right, but we rather mean a kind of virtue, a kind of disposition toward the world. So we mean being sincere. We mean being able to filter with some accuracy what's coming your way. Sincerity and accuracy are two very important virtues. I mean, we've typically got a situation where we've got insincere politicians saying certain things, and then we've got citizens who have in only a very limited sense the virtues of accuracy, and so there's very little possibility that the world's going to be got right in the process. And now I want to quickly mention a few more points of which I've made a note. And the first thing I want to say, I think, is just that the quality of our debate about this is spectacularly poor. I mean, on the one hand, we've got conversations about what we should ban and what we should displace or deplatform or remove because it's misinformation. And so it's a process of going around and saying, untrue, 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 take down, take down, take down. So it's a kind of approach of expelling or removing stuff from the informational environment. And of course, one of the great problems with that approach is that just because you close the door to a room doesn't make that room disappear. Just because you sort of, define away a certain group of citizens in your society into some box where you don't come into contact with them doesn't mean they're going to disappear. And here we're back to this old problem of no matter how unlovely some of us get, we all have to share a table of politics together and keep on talking. And then the response to this ban that approach is often some kind of quite facile and ill-defined, almost magical thinking-driven conversation about free speech and the marketplace of ideas. And the problem with that conversation is not so much that it's wrong as it doesn't really say anything constructive. And that's, what you typically hear on a lot of YouTube channels, a lot of major podcasts in response to this process of banning. You hear stuff like, yeah, man, it's about the marketplace of ideas, man. And the thing about the marketplace is it's just about the different perspectives coming together, man. And then it's about free speech, man. Because if you've got free speech, you've got that marketplace, man. And with the marketplace, you've just got these different perspectives and they're just going to be engaging and working each other out. So it's not our place now to show what is so wrong with this counter reaction to the first reaction, which is the banning reaction. But let's perhaps say something hypothetical here to help us. I mean, imagine that you and I and 10 other people start some kind of campaign on a social media platform, as is Facebook. And let's say our campaign is about flat Earth, and we want to convince people that the Earth is flat, and we keep posting and commenting all around Facebook, and there's 12 of us, and we're working sort of full-time on this. Let's look at a couple of issues that straight away come in. Now, first of all, imagine this difference. Imagine, first of all, that in one scenario, we are anonymous. Nobody knows who we are. Nobody can discover this, really, unless you're a state intelligence agency. And we're pumping this flat Earth stuff. And imagine another scenario where we're all identifiable. Let's say we're all philosophers from the UK, and we form this society. We've convinced ourselves that the Earth is flat, and it's clear where we're coming from, who we are, and we're pumping out this information. So this is the first thing that's really, really important. There's a world of difference between these two scenarios. Because in the first scenario, where this is being pumped untransparently, where it's not clear who is doing it, we don't know whether it's philosophers from London who are making this flat Earth argument, or if it's the North Korean government, or if it's the Kremlin. And it's hugely damaging when we can't discover this. And notice how this really fundamental point about transparency is already a conversation that's healthily to the side of this ban, marketplace of ideas, man, conflict that we typically have worked out in our culture. But now notice a second really important feature of this situation where 12 of us are pumping out this flat Earth stuff on Facebook. And that's that the algorithm will be doing something for us or against us. And now imagine this difference. Imagine that we've made a post about how everything is flat. And then imagine that the algorithm has shown it 100,000 times to different folks around the world. Then imagine alternate scenarios where it's shown it not 100,000 times, but just 100 times. And then another alternate scenario where it's shown it 100 million times. What's the difference? Why is it that number? Why is it shown it that number of times as opposed to showing it very, very little, or showing it apocalyptically on a massive scale? We don't know. This is a real problem. In other words, a lack of algorithmic transparency is a crisis for democracy. And just having algorithmic transparency already enables us to make a very significant step forward in terms of exploring how to stabilize our informational environment. We always lose our battery and we always come back. Let's now look at the two questions that came in from Izzy and from Michael. Izzy basically says, it'd be really good to have recommendations on this crisis that Russia has generated, the geopolitical implications, and anything else more widely you might recommend about public affairs. And Michael says, I'm having problems with both sideism. So people are saying there's disinformation on both sides. How do I trust through this? How do I negotiate my informational environment when it comes to Russia? Well, Michael, I've made a couple of quick notes before I turned on the iPhone to speak with you about points that I think might be relevant, but I don't want to get into any of them in depth now because we will inevitably end up talking about all of them on the channels. in due time. So one thing I want to say is that it's not up to you to establish that the West and the Western narratives are fluffy, pristine, and innocent and lovely. No, you just have to establish that there's a qualitative difference between the hysterical lies that the Kremlin's coming out with and what we're coming out with in the West. Second thing, concreteness. What's remarkable about a lot of folks who are offering pro-Putin perspectives or sort of soft on Putin perspectives is that as soon as you ask them to engage with Russian history, with contemporary Russian politics, with how the regime works, they lose any capacity to do anything at all because they simply don't know. So if somebody is coming out with something you're suspicious of, check what happens to them when they're made to get concrete. And almost always they immediately melt away because they simply don't have any sort of wherewithal of what's really going on in that country. And so therefore you can attribute a low epistemic credibility on their perspective. Next thing I want to say, and we'll be speaking more about this, is that it's really important to keep exploring what our conceptions of quality are, you know? And it's really important that we don't settle for Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's as quality just because we haven't tried other things. And I think there's a real risk of this with the later state of the internet. Just to take the example of philosophy, which is less controversial than other things we might take as examples. There are genuinely young people in the West now who think that there's a philosophical tradition that goes Nietzsche, John Stuart Mill, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and then Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And this is not a criticism of these two figures who are very different, about whom it's worth saying a lot, about both of them. But it's rather to say that, well, there's no continuity here. It's a bit like saying, well, we've got Brahms and we've got Schoenberg and then we've got Lady Gaga. That's not criticism of Lady Gaga to say that, I'm sorry, this is just a cross-categorization. So there is this sense of quality whereby we don't want to confuse something that's serving a very important cultural purpose with real intellectual stuff available to the culture that's of real quality. Then I want to quickly say that there is a big segment on the left at the moment that's very critical of Western imperialism, but isn't realizing that you've also got to be critical of other kinds of imperialisms, including worse kinds of imperialisms out there potentially. And the Russian enterprise is a blind spot for them because there is an imperial project, but they are so set on critiquing US imperialism for propping up Ukraine and so on, that they're not able to critique the Russian imperialism and compare it with the American imperialism and say, well, what's worse and why and how. And so there's a lot of the left that's just so fixated, they can't be transparent about calling out atrocious and violent Russian imperialism. And then there is something that we're also going to have a separate conversation about, and that's emotional intelligence as a way of just judging who you're going to trust. The problem with that is that there's a lot of people who've got spectacularly high IQ, who are just whizzes at various kinds of analytical thinking, but their emotional intelligence isn't very high. And so they can't look at somebody and say, well, actually, that's, whatever they say, that's a trustworthy person. That's a person who's speaking with sincerity. That's a person who's not being, let's say, some kind of toxic, manipulative narcissist. So, Michael, you know all of that, but I just wanted to mention these things before coming to a few remarks about actual sources about who to trust on Russia. So let's turn to that now. So let's make a few concrete recommendations now in each of several different categories. And this is just going to be a sample, not an exhaustive list. So my first category is public intellectuals. And here I want to recommend Michael Ignatieff. What Michael is unique at bringing is a kind of really three-dimensional moral psychology, a really adequate sense of our ethical response to the world. And he combines that first quality with the second quality, which is a hard-nosed, pragmatic political realism. And then his third quality is that he's an historian by training and has a wonderful sense of moments of cultural moment coming and going and the historical context of anything that happens. And I'm going to link up a talk by Michael about Russia's invasion of Ukraine below, and I genuinely recommend it as a introduction to how to put in historical context and in basic political context what this Russian invasion of Ukraine is really about. What Michael says is nuanced, adequate, and is fully endorsed by me. My connection with Michael is that he is the author of the autobiography of Isaiah Berlin, and I'm writing a book about some of Isaiah Berlin's political writings. So I'm particularly grateful for that aspect of what Michael's life has given us, but he's done so much in practical politics, in academia, in broadcasting, you name it. Now, my next category is facts. And I am actually going to recommend an organization you're very aware of, and that's Bellingcat. And I'm going to recommend Hristo Grozev, and I'm going to recommend Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. And that doesn't mean that I have looked over every investigation Bellingcat made and that I believe that Bellingcat are right about every position they've ever taken. Not in the least. But I am saying that Bellingcat is real, it does remarkable work, and that they're not some kind of malign agent serving some kind of nefarious purposes. They're real and they're trying to do good stuff. And Elliot Higgins himself, I can vouch for as being a very real man who is genuinely, in a very geeky way, is interested in digging, putting minutiae with minutiae together and trying to piece together some kind of big picture that's eluding us and then it's going to be really politically vital for us to discover. Elliot was a guest during a journalism festival a few years ago with me and a former partner. So I have seen Elliot in real life over breakfast. I can tell you he is okay. He is real. He's not acting in any kind of, nefarious way. You can basically trust him. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything or go along with everything, but it's a trustworthy agent. The other trustworthy agent, I would say, is conflict intelligence team that do a lot of work that's similar to some of what Bellingcat is doing, and I consume in Russian, but they also have an English Twitter feed. I consume in Russian that's sort of a military update from them on a fairly regular basis. The next category is Russian experts who are in Russia and don't speak English. And one expert I'm going to mention here is Gleb Pavlovsky. You can't easily access his work in English, but I often throw in little bits and bobs from him into our videos. And Pavlovsky is somebody who is very much in love with politics. He regrets some of the things he did in the past. He worked for the Putin regime in the early days of the Putin regime as a strategist and advisor. And he has no sense of what Putin is today, but he certainly has a deep sense of where Putin came from, what Putin was in the early days, and he is phenomenally critical of the regime, of course, and of this war. He is somebody who has a great deal to say about the shape of the Russian regime and its kind of intricacies and mechanics. But the problem is he can't be accessed. So who are Russia experts in Russia who do speak English? That's my second category. And here I'm going to introduce to you Grigory Yudin, who is a sociologist and political philosopher of the younger generation, who has been one of the very best voices that Russia has had over the course of this war about what's going on, how to make sense of it, and what to look out for. And Greg speaks good English. He did research work in the West, and so he often has articles and interviews coming out in English. I'm going to link something up below. I highly recommend Greg Yudin's commentary and analysis. Then the next expert I'm going to name is an expert on Russia based in the West. And that's going to be Arkady Ostrovsky, who is, of course, got rich Russian roots. And Arkady Ostrovsky runs the Russia coverage at The Economist, and that's why we'll actually come back to him in a moment and recommend his book and some of his work at The Economist. Then what about Russian journalists, specifically journalists, not commentators and experts of various kinds, but journalists? Well, here I'm just going to name Dmitry Muratov, who is perhaps a journalist in the complex sense. He's the editor of Novaya Gazeta, which is now in suspense or closed. But I'm going to recommend Dmitry Muratov, and I'm going to recommend a beautiful interview with him, which has subtitles by a really wonderful Russian documentarian and really sophisticated cultural figure, Katerina Gordeeva. Then the next category is day-to-day. Here actually you can put in whoever you particularly enjoy. Day-to-day journalistic coverage for a major media organization. I'm going to name Sarah Rainsford from the BBC. I think she's been doing a wonderful day-to-day job of the war. You can follow her on Twitter. Then an expert on disinformation and Russian propaganda specifically is Peter Pomerantsev. I highly recommend Peter. And I'm going to link up a talk by Peter about post-truth, fake news, disinformation, Russian propaganda. So we're going to stop for now and just name a few books that I recommend. If you're talking novels, then the novel that I recommend is called Fathers and Children, and it's about an intergenerational conflict in Russia that speaks very deeply, I think, to this question of Russia asking whether it's a European country and trying to, in a live way, keep itself engaged to this question. Then I recommend a series of essays on 19th century currents in Russian culture by Isaiah Berlin. They are extremely lucid and accessible. Then, in terms of books about the now, as it were, there are 3.5 that I'm going to recommend. I'm going to recommend this book by Arkady Ostrovsky, who we've just mentioned. And this is a really, really good book by somebody who really, really knows what they're talking about. And is doing not just great work here, but great work in the way they're running The Economist's coverage. Oh, let's do a quick intermission. What major journalistic institutions should you trust on? Forgot to mention this. What major journalistic institutions should you trust when it comes to Russian coverage? Well, let's be honest here. The New York Times and The Guardian, for example, do a lot of great work, but they're not near the top when it comes to factual reliability. So a lot of stuff coming out in The Guardian on Russia historically needs to be fact-checked, unfortunately. So I'm going to name 2 publications. The Economist, that has a really great and justly earned reputation for being factually accurate. I know their Russian program is couriered by Arkady Ostrovsky. So that means The Economist is the single best major journalistic institution in the English-speaking world to get Russia coverage from. Now, you might say, well, The Economist is regarded as a center-right publication with particular views on economic policy. Well, I'm really speaking completely independently of this. And so the recommendation really stands whether you are the most hardline conservative or whether you are a Marxist, of the classical kind. It doesn't matter. It's not this is not an ideological recommendation. The Economist coverage of Russia is solid. Next in line, and again, please don't take this as some kind of center-right proposal. It's for everybody. FT, the Financial Times. You're going to see a strictness about factual accuracy there that's not going to be surpassed by other major publications. Okay, back to books. So this, The Invention of Russia by Arkady Ostrovsky, is going to be linked in below. Next recommendation is going to be about the way Russian propaganda works. And it's a book that's a few years old now by Peter Pomerantsev, and it's called Nothing's True and Everything is Possible. And it's really about the postmodern quality of Russian propaganda. Then I'm going to name a book that could really potentially bore you out of your skin. But I'm going to recommend it because it's called Putin's People by Catherine Belton. And whatever you think about the book, it's just going to depend on how much of a deep dive you want to do. And I actually don't recommend this book for the majority of you as a result. But what I would say is that there's probably no Western journalist who is more detailed and more informed about the utter intricacies of the Russian regime and its genesis than Catherine Belton. So this is rigorous, detailed, nuanced stuff. And then there is this beautiful literary work by Svetlana Alexievich, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it's called Secondhand Time. And Kutsia says on the back cover, in the spellbinding book, Alexievich orchestrates a rich symphony of Russian voices telling their stories of love, death, joy, sorrow, as they try to make sense of the 20th century and of their country. That's again something to dip into. So, okay, these are recommendations for now. On top of all of the links below, the video I'm just going to leave here, just on the off chance you haven't seen it, is my video breaking down the 4 pathologies of mistrust in the West. Thank you so much for your time.